I really do want to say it's a privilege for me to be here in this role. The Nuffield Foundation is truly a special place, and I kind of feel that. It's a strongly independent institution, and one that I think is also uniquely well placed to take a longer view. And I cherish both of those characteristics. I've spent much of the last 30 years either working in central government or leading a very quick, highly kind of responsive think tank. So when I say it is a joy not to be beholden to a government view, something which I find myself thinking increasingly frequently in the morning, I say that with some feeling. And nor do I miss the demands of having to react to each day's events, because it creates more space for meetings and discussions like the one we're going to have today, which is all about the future. To help us with this, we've got a fantastic panel who we will be introduced in a minute by our chair for the rest of the session, who is the BBC's Ben Chu. Thank you very much, Ben, for not going on air and not being asked to go on air on 6 o'clock news and being here instead. I don't want to speak for too long, because you want to hear from them, but I do want to say a few words about a recent strategy review. Everyone's got a strategy, I know, but just like bear with me, I want to cover some of the themes of our strategy because they are important to our work. And then I want to say a little bit, just briefly, about the importance of today's topic. Now, in our strategy, we set out some of the broad challenges we want to explore in the years ahead. The context for this, as everyone in this room knows, is demanding. War in Europe, economic stagnation, populism on the rise, technological disruption, the climate crisis, as well as long-lasting entrenched inequalities between people and places. Taken together, these all add up to a serious test, if you like, of our social and economic resilience as a nation. And as one of the UK's leading funders of social and economic research, we feel very keenly the responsibility to ensure that the work we support matches the sort of scale of events of the day. We have to do everything we can to ensure that the decision makers that we want to sort of influence through the work that we support are equipped to confront the scale of the challenges of this decade and beyond. So our take on that through the quick review that we have done over the last 6 months or so in terms of our strategy since I've arrived, building on work that predated me, I should say, has been to sort of set out 5 expansive questions which speak to many of the key social problems of our age. I'll really just very briefly touch on these. The first is about prosperity and fairness. How do we achieve them in new times? What are the real trade-offs as opposed to the mythical ones between them? And how do we find the policy sweet spots that advance both? We're going to come back to this, and I'm going to touch on this when I talk a bit about the motivation for today's event. The second theme concerns building an inclusive society in the context of changing demography and changing ways of life. This motivates the crucial work we are doing at the moment to support racial justice through our Racial Diversity UK Fund, work which tragically feels ever more urgent with each day that passes. It also makes us very curious to explore issues like new models of care in a fairly rapidly aging country, as well as new routes to intergenerational justice. Third question, how can we ensure that developments in science and technology work for people and society? This runs through the work of the Ada Lovelace Institute that many of you will know of, as well as the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, which is a key part of Nuffield family. And it also extends into wider questions about the potential use and the limits of AI in our public services. We want Nuffield to be a home of thinking on how to govern wisely in an era when technology and science is advancing far more quickly than a capacity to understand fully all the societal risks and harms, as well as the benefits that may arise. Our fourth area is climate change. Now, this is newish terrain for Nuffield, but you can't be serious about questions of social equity and distribution in the decades ahead if you are not thinking hard about the impact of climate change and how the burden of the net zero transition can be fairly shared. Finally, we want to explore the importance of effective and trustworthy institutions. So much of our common life is shaped by organisations and by systems that make decisions on our behalf. All too often, the levels of trust in those institutions and those systems is very low. Rarely, though, does anyone really foreground the craft of institution building. How do we foster, how do we reimagine some of our institutions so as to improve decision-making, really engage the public and bolster confidence in governance? So all told, this does admittedly amount to an ambitious agenda, but we think it's right that we aim high in these times. And it's one we want to take forward through different ways of working. So Nuffield has always backed, as probably many of you would know, rigorous research illuminating the social challenges of our times. And this will very much continue to be central to our mission. Our chair, Sir Keith Burnett, will say a few words later about how our strategic fund, which is reopening, will support cross-cutting and high-impact research agendas in the following years. But we also have a long history of backing pioneering practical innovation that improves lives directly in communities, placing hopeful bets on the future, to recoin a phrase from Nuffield's past. We did this when backing cross-community schools in Northern Ireland at the peak of the Troubles. We also did it when we funded quite novel neighbourhood legal advice centres through the 1970s. So as well as having deep connections to the academy, Nuffield also has an institution building and change-making heritage. It's an approach that today the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory is very much taking forward. And in our next chapter, we want to renew both parts of this story. So now let me just turn briefly to today's theme, the social foundations of economic success, to put it briefly. Now, the connection between the economic and the social is sometimes conceived, in my view, in a rather unidirectional way, often flowing from the former to the latter. So at the last election, for instance, the debate was overwhelmingly about the need to get growth up in order to fund our public services and our welfare state. Now, that is not a surprise in a country which is stuck in a rut of low growth, high fiscal pressure and very squeezed public services. It is no surprise people talk about that. It's also no surprise that we all foreground productivity so much, given it is so central, not just to the economy, but also to the social condition of the country, because of course it determines people's wages and household incomes. But the title of this session is inviting us to also think about how the relationship works in the other direction, to consider how over the longer term, the quality of our social foundations can make or break our economic fortunes. Indeed, in my view, the last decade has taught us anything, it's perhaps that social anxieties and frustrations that weaken our foundations can be a very potent force, capable of trumping the prevailing economic wisdom of the age. We all know from our own lives that economic potential is inextricably tied to the social condition of our own families and communities, whether it be low levels of qualification, holding back the transition from education to work, poor workplace health, resulting in long-term sickness, inflexible childcare, preventing jobs for parents from taking new jobs, lack of affordable housing, preventing mobility, or weak social capital undermining community resilience. Our social infrastructure shapes our productive potential in schools of different ways, and it does so both locally and nationally. It determines how risk is shared in our society. Do those hit by an economic shock get smashed into the pavement, as a young Winston Churchill put it, or rather do they get steadied so they stay on their feet? And it shapes how opportunity is distributed between different groups and across different places. Now, none of this is a new insight. Social reformers from the Victorian era back to Beveridge often had a view of how their social reforms would generate economic dividends. Sometimes they were proven right. More recently, in the 1990s, there was a vast literature on social investment, which was highly influential in government for many years. Human capital, perennial Nuffield concern, was at the heart of this. From the early years to schools to workforce skills, alongside active labour market policy and a rising wage floor, the agenda achieved real results. It had blind spots, but it achieved results. Improved schools, rising employment, a reduction in wage inequality that people often overlook. Some of these gains have been sustained. Others have gone into sharp reverse over recent years. Lone parent employment was a long-term success story. And over the last 6 years has fallen really markedly, although no one much has talked about it. It's a very, very big reversal of an incredible change over the last generation of this country. Child poverty, as people probably do know, is on the rise. So now, I think, is a very timely moment to think afresh about what the new generation of evidence and research that is needed to help ensure that the social and economic policies of the late 2020s and beyond are up to the task. Let me just very briefly touch on 3 examples across the life course that are front of mind for me personally. First, when it comes to the early years, excellent Nuffield funded work by the IFS, and I'm not only saying this because Helen's about to come on stage and talk, although maybe a little bit, that research has shown in very, very forensic sort of way the large scale and long-term benefits from the Sure Start programme. Benefits that we have now decided to largely give up due to Shortstop's demise. But there are also benefits which are still there on the table, and we could reclaim if we act on this evidence and design a new generation of support. Then there is the rising number of young people not earning or learning, which is up markedly since the COVID era. 1 in 8 young people are NEET, increasingly due to mental health conditions. 1 in 10 25-year-olds have never experienced work, 1 in 10. Disastrous for the young people involved, but also exorbitantly expensive for taxpayers, a drag on growth, and a powerful generator of all manner of social problems in decades ahead. Again, there is evidence to deploy, but there are also large gaps in that evidence, and they need to be filled if we're going to make a real difference. Lastly, I just highlight the employment rate for those with significant health impairments in our country. Now, overall, the UK remains a relatively high employment society. We are successful largely on that front, always could do better, but that has been one of our successes. But if you look at the same league tables for people who have significant health conditions, we tumble right down them. Now, for a country which is going through an aging process, that is a grade A strategic weakness, and it's one that we need to think carefully about how to improve on. And there are lots of other countries who have, through concerted employer engagement, welfare support and targeted health intervention, made big differences on this front. Unfortunately, we have a speaker coming up in Sir Charlie Mayfield, who I think will say a thing on this topic. Now, at Nuffield, we want to use our resources and our convening power to inform these and many other debates. Our deep commitment to empiricism means we will highlight promising evidence, just as we will point out ill-conceived policy initiatives. But our commitment to social improvement means we also need to be alive to the risk of something which we might call reckless caution. When a burning problem like the plight of so many of our disadvantaged young people is met with sustained timidity. So these are just a few themes that I want to touch on. I really look forward to hearing what our panel have to say. They're all here with ideas about what Nuffield should get behind and back. I want to hear what all of you have got to say. We're at the start of this process in this new period, so we're all ears, really. Let me just finish by saying the world around us is certainly in flux, and Nuffield is evolving its areas of interest, but our fundamental purpose to advance social well-being and to do so in fast-changing times is constant. It's been the same since it was set by our founding trustees in the midst of World War II. And I very much hope that everyone here in this room today will be part of our next chapter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Gavin. I'm Ben Chu from the BBC, as you mentioned. It's really great to be here. Thank you to Nuffield for inviting us, convening this. And it's our theme, you're going to see behind us, is what are the social foundations of a strong economy, and what social investment strategies do we need now? And I think you set it up really well, Gavin, in pointing out that social goods are often very much seen as building on the economic goods. I'm often asked as an economic journalist, what's the point of higher GDP growth? How does that benefit me? And I say things like, well, it'll lead to higher wages and higher incomes and higher living standards, and maybe a country more at ease with itself. And the framing is exactly that, the social is built on the economic. So I think it's a really good opportunity to flip it around and, as you say, talk about how sometimes, or maybe often, the economic goods are built on those social investments. And by social investments, I mean, I take it to mean things like, obviously, education, healthcare, childcare, housing, as you mentioned, Gavin, and the welfare system, but also some things like arts clubs, youth clubs, those things which build a sense of community in an area, community and belonging. And I want to talk about those as well. And to be fair, this isn't a totally alien conception at all in our politics. I'm old enough to remember Boris Johnson's Levelling Up programme and the idea that you need to show people that their lives are getting better to make any progress and to build any cohesion economically and socially, especially in left behind areas. I'm also old enough to remember the Conservatives during the coalition time, Big Society. I don't know if that rings a bell with anyone, but that was built around the idea that community groups could take over the provision of public goods as the state retreated. So whether or not that idea was misconceived, it was certainly concerned with the social foundations of our economy and our society. So 15 years on from the big society, let's ask with this panel, what role can and does social policy play, and what does the evidence say about what works and what we should invest more in? And we've got a fantastic panel to discuss all of those questions. I'm just going to introduce them now. So Charlie Mayfield on my right, former John Lewis boss, and currently, really importantly, the lead of the Keep Britain Working review, which is investigating how government and business can work together to support ill and disabled people into work, boosting living standards. Next to him, we have Kate Josephs, who is the Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, former Director General of the Cabinet Office's COVID-19 Task Force, and then Helen Miller, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and finally Ravi Gurumurthy, the Chief Executive of Nesta, which is described as the UK's innovation agency for social good. So a really excellent panel to discuss all aspects of this topic. So they're each going to speak for 5 minutes on their thoughts on this question about strong foundations of a strong economy. And then we're going to have an audience Q&A. So get your questions ready and grab my eye when we get to that part. We're going to take some questions from the online audience as well. But let's start with you, Sir Charlie. Social foundations of a strong economy. Perhaps you could start by talking about how employers and workplaces feed into that, or reinforce those strong foundations.
No, thank you, Ben. And I think Gavin's given me a good sort of intro into this. I suppose the way I would segue from sort of the title into what I'm going to talk about is that, you know, employment is an absolutely critical part of society, and what goes on within employment matters hugely, both to good society and to actually creating a strong economy. So it's highly, highly relevant to that. And the review that I'm leading is called Keep Britain Working. It is focused, as Gavin said, on ill health and disability, and particularly how we keep people in employment who are suffering from ill health conditions or who have disabilities. And in a sense, I suppose, you know, you could say that, you know, a measure of society and how good it is, and indeed the role of employers within it, is caught up within how effectively we do that. And as Gavin has kind of said, we don't do it well enough right now. It is, and I think it's worth also saying that in amongst all the many issues that we're grappling with, you know, it's quite easy to sort of think, well, what are the biggest issues we're facing, and is this one of them? Well, I would contend that it actually is probably one of the biggest single issues that is facing employment market and indeed our ability to grow. It is also actually, I'm going to suggest to you, one of the most solvable as well. Now, and I'm not, I mean, we haven't yet published the report. We are probably due to do so in just over a month or so. So I'm not going to tell you everything that's in the report, but I can tell you that having spent the last, you know, good part of the last sort of 9 months nearly, really in this space, I am of the view that it is both a serious and deeply embedded problem, but also one for which there are many solutions that are not so difficult to grasp. And so I feel actually very positive about our ability to deal with it. I think just building on it, I mean, there's a lot of focus on welfare. The fact that, and indeed the fact there are 2.8 million people of working age who are not working because of ill health or disability conditions. That is a 40% increase on where we were in 2019. It's 800,000 more people. And if things carry on as they are, there'll be another 600,000 people added to that group between now and 2029. And that's fundamentally underpinning what's driving the welfare bill and all the costs of welfare and the forecasts that we'll hear about and the huge numbers that are associated with that. But while I think it's very important to focus on trying to tackle welfare, as we, indeed the government has recently discovered, it's very difficult to tackle the stock of the problem. And what you have to look at is where are all these people coming from? They haven't just appeared out of thin air. You know, actually, there are more people in work now with ill health conditions and disabilities than ever before in history. And so these people are coming from somewhere. And so actually what we need to tackle is the flow, where they're coming from. And we need to work doubly hard, actually, on keeping those people in work. And there's a lot we can do to do that. I haven't got time to go into all of the things that we've discovered, but I'll say 3 things very quickly about the nature of the problem. So the first is there's a tremendous amount of fear. So individuals who have ill health conditions or disabilities, generally speaking, are extremely frightened of telling anybody about it. And that really matters, because if you don't know about something, you can't do something about it. However, the fear is also shared by employers. a lot of employers and line managers are fearful of addressing or stepping into issues of ill health or disability with their employees because they don't want to cause offence, they don't want to cause some kind of complaint or grievance, let alone an employment tribunal. And so there's a tendency that from fear that it just simply drives people apart. It creates distance. Second big issue is that there is huge variation in the support that's available within the workplace. And again, I haven't got time to go into all the detail of it, but this from very good to frankly non-existent. And in addition to that, we have a system whereby when people get ill, probably one of the first things they think about is going to their GP. And what we're asking our GPs to do is actually not possible really for those GPs to do. And GPs say this as much as I do. GP can absolutely assess a patient and say, are they ill? Yes, so yes. And how do I treat them? But what we're asking them to do is to also say, and while that person is ill or while they're getting better, they're able to do this amount of work. But they can't do that because they don't know what the work conditions are like. They don't know whether the employer is supportive or not supportive, whether there's opportunities to flex things in this way or that way. And 93% of fit notes say that people are not fit for work. So again, the lack of support, and particularly that aspect, creates even more distance. And what we know is that the longer people are not talking to each other and the longer people are absent from work, the less and less likely it is that they will return. And the more likely it is that their ill health conditions will compound and turn. You have this real issue of comorbidities building up, which just simply creates bigger and bigger obstacles to overcome, which needn't happen. Huge issue. So fear, lack of support. And the third big issue that we have really come very, very much face to face with is that if you are a disabled person, those issues of fear and lack of support have a particularly acute impact on you, particularly. And it's evidenced in the disability employment gap, which is much lower than it is in other countries, much worse than it is in other countries. And it's evidenced in shocking statistics, like if you take groups of people with learning difficulties, for example, less than 5% of people with learning difficulties are in paid employment. Now, that's a shocking figure, an absolutely shocking figure. So it's a huge issue. There is, though, as I said, quite a lot that can be done about this. And it really boils down to how do we get employers on the pitch and how do we support and enable them to be there and be effective in that role. What we have seen is examples where this is already happening and the results are dramatically better than they are for the country as a whole. So to a significant extent, this can be addressed by creating the conditions where we see a greater adoption of the practices that will make the biggest difference. And in many respects, what the review is doing is figuring out how do we orchestrate and encourage and incentivize that outcome. And I can't tell you today precisely how we're going to do that because that is the sort of absolutely heart of the review. But what I can tell you is that we've got, I think, some very practical and implementable ideas and recommendations. And also that we have found throughout the entirety of this review that there are a lot of people, many employers, many providers, many people all across the country who really want to be part of the solution. And so I'm actually very confident we're going to not only be able to publish the report, but actually simultaneously point to a lot of people who want to be part of solving this. And in that, I think there's tremendous opportunity. This current government is looking to drive growth and fairness. For many employers, they see those two things in competition one with the other. This is actually an example of where you can bring them together and actually drive both growth and fairness really effectively.
Well, thank you, Charlie. That's incredibly encouraging that you see it as a solvable problem. We can't wait for your report now. Tell us how to do it. But thank you for that. Now, Kate, perhaps you could tell us about how you in Sheffield are helping build those strong foundations, those strong social foundations.
Thanks, Ben. And I'll try really hard to maintain the optimistic tone. I think actually in all of our roles, it's really, really critical that we recognise that optimism and optimistic leadership on these challenges is one of the key things we need. So just to, yes, I'm Chief Executive of Sheffield City Council, Sheffield, fourth largest city in England. I won't bore you with how amazing our city is. Oh, it's amazing. I'm also, yes, thank you. Where's some more whips? Anyway, I'm also really privileged to be the chair of Core Cities UK, which are the 12 largest cities outside of London. So I'll talk about examples from Sheffield, but as we get into Q&A, I'm happy to try and bring in to my best understanding some of the examples from across the UK. And before I came to Sheffield, I was a senior leader in the civil service for about 20 years and worked in the US government as well. And I guess what I'd say from that is I've seen firsthand how national policies designed through many different iterations and administrations, good, bad, ugly. I've also now seen local government, and frankly, I don't think I'd ever want to go back, how clearly these policies land, how they affect people's lives, where they succeed, where they don't, and how important it is that the sorts of interventions that Charlie's been speaking about are also really tailored and understand the real context of different places. So that's probably what I'll major on. And in terms of the question space, the sort of what are the social foundations of a strong economy, if that feels remotely esoteric, it really to anyone here or abstract, it really doesn't in local government. It is our daily reality. We can't have conversations about growth in a place like Sheffield without understanding and living with the consequence of decades of stagnation and inequality, how they play out in our communities, on the doorsteps with our residents. We see what happens when health outcomes fall behind, when housing is insecure, and when skills don't match opportunity. And we see, most importantly, and again, the example that Charlie's given is a really good space in that, how all of these things compound in real people's lives and in real communities. Poor housing leads to poor health. Lack of transport means that you can't get to a job. So I think that's why local government is an absolutely critical voice in this conversation. I'm really pleased that Gavin's asking us to be here today to bring some of that realism. We sit at that intersection of social and economic, and every day we're navigating those trade-offs between how you drive prosperity and how you reduce inequality. And I guess to give a really sort of Sheffield specific example that we often come back to, as a city, and those of you know this, it really demonstrates the challenges very vividly. We have incredible assets, world-leading advanced manufacturing, very thriving digital sector, some of the wealthiest areas in the country within the city, 2 great universities, okay. more green space than any other city in the UK. But we also have incredibly deep inequalities. There's a particular bus route in Sheffield that goes from one of the richest areas, Fulwood, to Chapeltown. And on that journey, about 3.5 miles, the healthy life expectancy drops by 15 years in one city. And that journey makes the point clearly. We can't drive growth in our city, which is a massive priority for my political leaders and for our mayor in South Yorkshire, without also thinking about the wider social determinants and what we need to make homes safe, for work to be good work. So, good jobs that are with employers who care about their staff and their colleagues and look after them when they have challenges around health and care. So I think it shows the problem, but also the potential. So I'll just say a little bit about some of the things we're doing in Sheffield, and many other cities have examples like this. Many other places and counties and regions in the UK are doing this work, sometimes quietly, oftentimes not necessarily driven by or helped by national policy, for a very long time unfunded or underfunded, I would argue. We in Sheffield are really proud that we are the home of the government's opportunity mission now, linked to our Sheffield Policy Campus. That's been a really brilliant organic development in Sheffield. There are more policy civil servants in Sheffield than any other place outside Whitehall. They are concentrated in DPP, in employment, in DFE, in MOJ, and those colleagues now, who've often been there for a very, very long time, are working together, talking to each other, and showing what's possible when you do things differently, including working with the region and the city. Indeed, to speak back to something that Gavin mentioned, the work that we are currently working on at the moment is very, very focused on needs. And what we're trying to do is deep policy innovation through the policy campus, but working with frontline services to understand the cohorts and the individuals who are presenting as need and that growth in our place. So not seeing it as a kind of analytical challenge, but actually saying, who are these young people and why is it that we have data over here that says they're struggling at school, or they've been struggling at school, and data over here that says their parents are presenting not in work, and data over here that says that they're getting in trouble, but we can't bring it all together. Equally, if you walk into one of our family hubs in Sheffield, you'll see that in action. Again, Gavin mentioned Sure Start in Sheffield. We managed to hang on to family hubs through very forward-thinking political leadership over a very long time, not in all areas, but in our most deprived areas. And now we're doing work with the Cabinet Office around Tesla and Grow. That means that you've got DGP job centre staff in the same place as you have early and postnatal and prenatal services from the NHS, fantastic nursery provision, and that is deep and embedded in communities, and it's really different in different parts of the city. If you go to Darnall, which is a really ethnically diverse area, you'll feel it feels of the place. It feels very different to the family hub in, say, Shire Green. And all of that happens by accident. It's taken persistence, it's taken consistent leadership, and it's taken often doing things in the face of no support or funding from a national level. The final thing I'll just speak to, I suppose, is why I feel really positive. So we've got that spirit of innovation in Sheffield that we've always had, as have many other cities. But I think what you're seeing now that's really exciting, linked to devolution. But I guess when I think of devolution, I don't think just of what's in the white paper and national government deciding that regions and local government can have some bits of stuff. I mean the spirit that says actually in places, our universities, our businesses, our health providers, our local authorities, our communities, our voluntary sector organisations are starting to come together and act like a system, our schools. In Sheffield, in the last few years, we've developed city goals for the next decade, which have been bottom-up developed, not politically developed by the council, but were developed through consultation and discussion with our communities. And those goals, all of our institutions have committed that they're going to be the North Star, but they deliver towards. And to come back to the question, one of them is to shape Sheffield around fairness, well-being and combating poverty. So that means that when we set out our growth plans, which we have, when we set out our plans around housing strategy or community strategy, when we work with the Mayor on inward investment, it's rooted in that commitment that any growth that happens in our city will benefit the whole city. And that means everybody on that bus route from Forward to Chapeltown. So hopefully we can give you some more examples as we go in, but thank you for listening to how it feels in the real world up there.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction to the real world. I think we really benefit from that. Now, so Helen, I think anyone who looked at the Institute of Fiscal Studies today might come away with the impression, oh, they care about economics, most of them. They care about the bottom line, they care about finances. Now, I know, having consumed IFS output for many, many years, that that's complete erroneous caricature, that you do care about the social foundations. You're very, very intently. So perhaps you could tell us more about how we can build them up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought I would use my few minutes to say a few words, share a few insights drawn from the Deaton Review, which was this huge multi-year project looking at a wide range of inequalities. So not just inequalities in income and wealth, but health, place, race, everything else you can list basically. Looking at when these inequalities arise, why they matter, how we can deal with them, all made possible by Nuffield. So very thank you to Nuffield for letting that project happen. There were like 100 papers, so I'm not going to do anything like justice to that project. But I thought I'd pick up on Gavin's point earlier about the interplay between kind of growth and social outcomes. Give you an example, both of where I think stronger social outcomes lead to growth, but then also how growth can lead to stronger social outcomes. But I'll pick up both of those. You're absolutely right. I've always cared about these things and I've been writing about these things for 50 years, so it's not new. On the social outcomes to growth, I thought I'd talk about human capital, because in some ways it's the most, everyone gets behind the idea that human capital matters, obviously as a key means to improve equality of opportunity. We directly care about people's welfare, but also it's good for the economy if you have people who have higher human capital. And there is some good news in this space. If you look at average test scores at GCSE level, on average they are rising. We have some world-class universities. There's some good news there. But there's also a bunch of, I think, persistent problems that we have. And in fact, one of the things I did this summer was make a mini podcast series using our podcast, doing a really big deep dive into kind of the opportunities missions and all of these different things. And I'm honestly still a bit haunted by some of the statistics that we just went through in that. And one of the things, and there's a long list of these statistics that haunt me, but one of them was just, we looked a lot at, you take a 5-year-old, take the 5-year-olds that are struggling, you can predict with a horrifying degree of accuracy that there'll be the people at 16 who are struggling. And it's not saying you can't change anything, but it just so happens that whatever's happening, we're not changing things. Kids that struggle at 5 struggle at 16. And I think that's just one example of where, we have these problems. They can't be left to the education system alone. It has to be something where we're tackling it with multiple policy tools. I mean, again, as one example of that, one of the statistics that's also touched my mind, 1 in 3 children below the age of 16 have an interaction with social services. 1 in 3. That means the state is thinking that in 1 in 3 children's lives, they need to intervene to make sure that kid is okay. I think that's shocking. But it also speaks to, even if your ultimate aim is to have human capital investments in schooling, it's not enough to just look at education policy. You have to look at all the things that go on in the wider lives of children, which might be the family hubs and the support for parents. It could be youth justice system. It could be youth clubs. It could be all sorts of things. But there are multiple policies at play. And one of the exam questions in our speaker brief was, where are the economic returns to social investments highest? It's a great question. I think what I'd say is we shouldn't just think about what is the single thing we can do with the highest return. I think it's like there are complementary investments you can make. And I think you have to think about the system and all the investments you can make and how they come together to mean that we're moving the dial. Just in education too, I mentioned there are some persistent problems. There are also some new challenges. So the humongous rise in special educational needs is one that obviously stands out. It's a system that it seems all parties are unhappy with, the children, the parents, the teachers, the state. It needs serious reform. And again, we should be thinking in the round about those problems, because actually you're not just seeing an increase in special educational needs. A lot of those children are also getting disability benefits through other parts of the system. Again, it's a holistic thing to sit there. And finally, on human capital, there are also parts of the system that we've long known are a problem and we've long overlooked, where I think further education is the glaring example of that. So I was doing more swatting up this summer and looking into lots of education stuff that I've been working on for years, but I was just kind of immersing myself in. And I can't help but thinking that we have a system that was designed by people who went to university, who thought their children would go to university. And that's great if your kid goes to university. What about other kids that don't go to university? And I think, again, it's not a new problem, but yet we haven't quite cracked it. So I think it's a case where we need multiple policies coming together, both for new and old challenges. But I thought I'd also say on that flow from social investment to growth, it's not just about money. It's not just about let's put more money into social investments and we get growth. We could argue about that. But also it is about designing those policies really well. So however much money you're putting into it, if you can design policies that are more effective, you can have better outcomes too. So I think we have to have both thinking about the investments and design of policies. But that's kind of the flow from social investments to growth. Let me turn to the flow from growth to social outcomes. I think there's a bit of a tendency, especially in recent years, to sort of think that stronger growth is bad for income inequality, and therefore people worry about growth and there being this trade-off. And you can find examples where stronger growth in the 80s, for example, has led to higher inequalities. But I think it's one of the things that actually the Deaton review and the huge bodies of work that went around that really drew out quite nicely. You can also draw really strong lines between periods of stagnant growth and really bad social outcomes and increases in inequality. So if you take the period, since the financial crisis, income inequality has barely changed. It's fallen a little bit. You've seen big increases in other inequalities. Again, another depressing statistic that I kind of carry around with me is that it now actually matters much more what your family background is. It matters not just how much you get your human capital, you go to work, you earn money. It matters how rich your parents were and how much you're going to inherit. That's a bit depressing, right? So yes, we didn't have income inequality going up, but we did have wealth inequality going up. We had intergenerational inequality going up. Social mobility is harder in a low growth country because it becomes zero sum. Like if my kid wants to do better, it's got to be for somebody else's kid. That's not good for social cohesion. Much better if we're all growing and all of our children can be moving forward. I think it's also worth saying, as well as those kind of direct effects, growth in the past has underpinned a lot of the social investments we've made. So when we made big investments in big expansion in the welfare state, that's often come about because we had big growth that made more resources, the economy was bigger, then you can start doing things like introducing a welfare state or doing other things. So I think there is this strong and important link between growth and social outcomes. So I'm going to bring all that together. Hopefully this is a cycle going on thing. I think we want growth. I think we shouldn't be ashamed of saying growth is good. Of course, we want to set up the conditions for that growth to make sure that it works for places and that it's benefiting lots of people. We might want to shape the kind of growth we get and think about, I'm thinking particularly about spatial issues now, and think about, what we do in different areas matters, and do we want to try and make sure we get growth out of London and all those kinds of good things. We can all think about how to distribute the proceeds of those growth, and that could just be in a classic tax and benefit kind of way, but it can be used through a whole set of social interventions. But I think we still definitely want growth. And I think we shouldn't fall into the habit of only looking at one side of the flow that Gavin talked about. I think it really is seeing the bi-directional of those things and thinking about how we can make that, hopefully get a virtuous circle going between these things.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Hannah. That's really excellent. Now, Ravi, let's have your opinion on how Nesta wants to go about restoring those social foundations.
So I'm not going to talk about what Nesta's going to do. I thought I'd cover a few hobby horses on terms of research topics, failure modes, and also what foundations can do. In terms of hobby horses, one that Nesta is doing something about, which is around obesity. So obesity, 2/3 of people are overweight in the country, 30% of people are obese, and it costs around about £125 billion a year, according to Frontier Economics' most recent study. Interestingly, about 30 billion of that 125 is to do with productivity. So it is a serious sort of economic consequence. What's interesting also about it is that solving it is largely about regulation and tax and structuring the food environment or GLP-1s. It's not inherently a hugely expensive solution, which is welcome at the moment. And the second area, and if I was really going to focus my attention, it'd probably be around adolescent and youth mental health, just because the size of that change is huge. The mismatch between service provision and need is massive. It's obviously driving economic inactivity, and it's also happening at a point of young people's maturation that it could have quite long-term consequences. So I would put that pretty much top of the list right now. I think it's also an area where there are promising interventions around CBT and digital CBT, and there's questions about how you blend the digital and the physical and the right blend of face-to-face and digital. But there's also quite big questions about the etiology that need to be researched as well. So I think it's quite a wide range of areas to get into. My third area is around social media, partly in relation to mental health, but also actually social media and the information diet we consume more generally, and the distraction cost and the erosion of attention. And that's, I think, again, an understudied, an under-quantified area. Fourth one, which is familiar to Nuffield, which you funded, which is around social networks and social capital and the role it has in social mobility. We did some work on this as well, looking at the Facebook data and how cross-class interactions improve the social mobility. It feels like a still an under-recognised policy area. It is hard to make it tractable. I think the policy implications are difficult, but I think it's still worth looking at. Human capital, I think 20 years ago, Gavin, you mentioned how much human capital had been put on the map by research. It strikes me right now we talk about human capital a lot less compared to bridges and roads and transport and planning reform. And we might talk about it even less with AI, because there may be a temptation just to underinvest. I think asking ourselves what forms of human capital are going to be valuable that we need to nurture. My final hobby horse, agency and internal locus of control. I was always struck when I looked at the longitudinal studies about how predictive internal locus of control at age 11 was of later life chances. And I think, what are the agency enhancing interventions, or how do we design with human agency in mind? It's something of interest. Okay, failure modes. You often hear people, particularly when I'm in government meetings, you hear people say, well, what we need to do is there's loads of amazing work going on, we just need to roll it out. And I disagree with both parts of that statement. One, yes, there's loads of great work, there is obviously, but when you sometimes do the randomised trial or quasi-experimental trial, looking at the actual effect size of some interventions, 0.2 standard deviation, when the starting point of that child's reading is very, very low, can often not be as life-changing as we might like. And I think we need to look at things that are sometimes a bit more life-changing than what we've got at the moment. So I would say the best is good, but the best is just not good enough. And with technology around early diagnosis or around personalisation, we ought to be able to look at higher effect sizes and more life-changing interventions. And then secondly, just roll it out. We all know that obviously diffusion and scaling is a behavioural or innovation challenge in its own right. We need to innovate in how we do scaling. Other failure mode, I think, is prematurely sort of impatience, either ignoring doing the deep qualitative research that gets under the skin of what is going on. There's so many areas where I think we just don't know enough. And then also prematurely jumping to an RCT or a trial. And then the third one, I think, is not being strict enough about when are you trying to do trials to understand a deep causal pattern, such the work that Helen's just done today, which we funded around looking at the impact of the 2-child limit on school readiness. So it's really illuminating a question about should we invest in cash v services. That's a big question. versus ones which are about product innovation and constantly testing. And it's different types of research. Both's got its value. And then sort of foundations, choices for foundations. We've got quite a lot of money, and Nuffield's got quite a lot of money, but compared to the size of these problems, it's not very much. And you have to, I think, have a certain degree of humility about how can you be catalytic. And I thought there's a few choices in relation to that. One is when selecting problems, overweight tractability rather than just importance of the problem. I think we sometimes go overweight how big a problem is rather than is it tractable, and sometimes go where there is momentum and actual energy rather than just going for the white space where no one's doing anything. I think similarly, there are occasions where there is a driver of change and technology is a good one where it could emerge in a way that concentrates power or disperses power, and how do we act as a sort of catalyst for it going in a certain direction. So again, you're not trying to build momentum, you're trying to shift the direction it's already happening. The third one, if I can read my handwriting. Oh yeah, so I mean, I think one of the interesting examples of foundations that made a bit of a difference in America is around drug research into psilocybin, for instance, and others into PTSD. I think that's interesting in that foundations can play a role doing what nobody else would have the risk appetite to do and run trials on something. But then once you've proven that, it's likely that it will get taken up by the medical establishment and government in due course. So I think it's worth thinking, are there areas which are almost off bounds, which no one really wants to touch? So my example actually would be, here's one that's, so sexual activity. We actually did a trial around intimate partner violence, which was all about tackling both the reasons for people rowing in Liberia and Uganda was money and sex. And we did interventions around improving people's sex lives and improving the way in which they do financial planning. And it was one of the most effective trials. This is my previous job at the International Rescue Committee. That's an example where I think it's quite hard for funders to take that risk, and it's out of bounds, but it's actually hugely important. So that's a final. Yeah, final one was: are you going for solutions or the enablers of solutions? So are you funding the data infrastructure that allows something, or are you building institutions like institutions that bridge research, practice, and venture building? So schools or hospitals that are constantly innovating, researching rather than just in practice. So I think it's worth thinking about that point of leverage rather than just going straight to the solution end.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. That was a huge amount of challenge there. It's really great for this session. So I just want to pick up on a few things that you mentioned there. I think one thing that strikes me is two things that you and Helen and Kate said about moving jobs outside of London. And I mentioned at the start the levelling up objective. You don't hear much about that anymore. Tackling geographical inequalities. Now, there is some people have a view that they are that's in tension with the idea of growing the economy. It's moving resources around. It may make some areas better off, but it's not going to grow the overall pie. Other people counter that actually it's a way of enhancing national productivity, unleashing the potential of places like in the north, like Sheffield, like Manchester, like Birmingham. I want to get your view on that, first of all, Kate. I mean, do you think, in terms of Sheffield's economic potential, do you think the previous government, in a way, had it right with that emphasis on levelling up, and it should come back a little bit?
I mean, I don't think it has gone away. I feel like I think the devolution agenda has changed the nature of the conversation. So it's less of a sort of top-down, we're going to level you all up or whatever, and more of a conversation with places. So I think it doesn't feel to me like it's gone away. It feels like we're having more evidence-based, equal conversations with government about the role that places like Sheffield and the northern cities and our regions can have. Sorry, I think I'm a bit echoey on my mic. I don't know if that's yes. I suppose the other thing I'd just say, like, we also have, I think, real opportunities through collaboration. So if you just took the full, I mean, this is a well-trodden path. It has been trodden many times, but if you took, say, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, 4 cities where the distance from one end to the other is about the same as the distance of the Queen Elizabeth line, and you invested in a way, you got all of those 4 cities just growing at the rate that Manchester's growing, that's multiple billions of GPA for the country. And that's because, you know, in a place like Sheffield, you've got highly skilled people who can't get to jobs that, you know, because it takes an hour to get from Sheffield to Leeds, which is 32 miles away. So I think there are points there which are just like, you know, yes, the size of the pie has to grow, but actually where you've got people with potential, you've got assets. I mean, you know, in Sheffield, you could point to those advanced manufacturing assets, those assets in energy and hydrogen, all those things, but you can't get the human capital to the place. I think there's a huge opportunity to drive that growth. And but yeah, I think we're having good conversations on it. Doesn't feel like it's gone backwards.
Okay, let me bring you in on that point about devolution, Charlie. I mean, how much you hear quite often, don't you, from mayors and regional leaders that give us control of the skills budget and we can get better bang for our buck in terms of local results than just doing it all from Whitehall. Is that something you're looking at in your review, and do you agree with that point of view?
Absolutely. So I think one of the analogies I sometimes use is if there was an arm filing on this table, that everybody who's trying to solve the issue of ill health and disability in the workplace, I think you could probably apply analogies to other things. This table will be covered with arm filings. And the biggest and most obvious mistake you can make would be to sort of tip them on the floor and then say, great news is our arm filing, and we're going to solve the problem. So the whole philosophy we've adopted within the review is that we need to be thinking more like, how do we create magnets that align and amplify and increase the impact of the resources that are already there? And actually, you know, we've been having some great conversations, including with Mayor Cobham, as we were teasing about the other day, in South Yorkshire with Andy Burnham's team in Greater Manchester, in the North East, and also in West Midlands. Because the fact is, there are ready-made great groups of people who are already heavily engaged in trying to improve their own societies, if you like, and that includes, you know, all elements of society: employers, you know, healthcare providers, third sector organisations, political leaders. And this notion of community is actually much more easily established within regions, because, of course, it's something which is local, something which you can relate to. And furthermore, you know, one of the things we're thinking about very carefully is that, you know, we can't address this issue of how you keep Britain working just with huge national businesses. Actually, they have vast resources and oftentimes a better place, therefore, to do things. The more important audience, in many respects, are the smaller, mid-sized businesses. And by definition, they tend to be local. And so, actually, what's great about the conversations we're having is these are the best ways for us to figure out how do we take our recommendations and work with you know, authorities and other groups around the country to try and drive this. I absolutely believe that we will only solve this issue by engaging the people who are already on the pitch.
I want to move on to something that you said, Ravi, which is really interesting in terms of designing social policy: tractability versus the size of the problem. It's a really interesting way of framing it. I.e., don't just go for the big problem, go for the problem you can solve, and you'll never get better results that way, more efficient use of public money. Did you have anything in particular in mind when you're talking about that trade-off, where we're focusing on big problems when specific things we can solve more easily?
No, I didn't have that. I think it was just making the general point in that mental health is a good example where we thought about doing quite a lot of work on it 5 years ago and sort of felt a little bit pessimistic at the time about our ability to make a difference. Now, I think one way of funding things is to be a bit less big bang and say, look, you're going to maybe start with small teams in 5 different areas and then gradually winnow down, because I think sometimes you can struggle to make the decision ex ante about which is the most fertile area when you're starting off a programme. So that'd be my only sort of advice, and maybe not. And
Helen, interested in IFS's view on that, because you think about which are the most important things for the IFS to get its analysis on. But do you start by saying what's a big problem, or do you start by saying what's a solvable problem, or how do you think about this question?
More often than not, we do, and I think we should think about what's a big problem, actually. So I kind of sympathise with the you want things that are tractable, and obviously for us that means thinking about what have we got data on, what can I actually go and estimate, what could we actually find, where can we push forward the knowledge frontier. I think that matters. And I think often you do want to pick something where you've got some data and you really can learn something new about the world. I do, however, maybe disagree on this. I think there are some problems that are too big to ignore. So even if they're a bit intractable, you have to tackle them anyway. So maybe it's right that most times you pick things that are tractable because you can make real progress and you can chip away at them. And most of what we do is tractable stuff. But I was struck by what Gavin said about AI, and that's going to be a great example for society actually, where that's going to be really hard to make tractable. Nobody here knows what AI is going to do to their own workplaces, let alone to society. And you can map out all sorts of different possibilities. I don't think actually it's good enough for us to wait until we sort of see what happens, then say, well, then let's mop things up. I think we have to really challenge ourselves. This is not mean I'm thinking about this for IFS and our research, but I think more broadly, what could we do now? What could we collect data on? What could we start thinking about? What kind of policies could we, toolkits could we put in place to say, what would policymakers start to look for? When would you start to see signs that you might want to do this rather than that? I don't know the answer to that, but I think that would fail the tractability test in some sense. And I think for most problems that sort of might be okay, but I think there are some problems, and I probably put things like, things that could really shape society, like AI or climate change. They're sort of just too big. I think we have to basically make them tractable. And if that means collecting more data or having new methods, or again, in my world, that might mean, okay, we've got a problem we can't solve, but we're going to design a new econometric method so we can solve it. We're going to go collect some more data so we can do it. So maybe that's just a difference in emphasis, but I think some things are too big not to ignore.
I also want to pick up one point you made, Helen, about public money is not the only answer. It's about the design of policy as well, just kind of following on from that. But I want to ask you about, you mentioned that you hadn't had a lot of funding for the things, some of the good things you're doing in Sheffield. I mean, we are coming out of an era, or still in an era, we're saying, really, really tight funding for local governments, legacy of the austerity area. To what extent do you agree with Helen that actually public money isn't everything, or actually is it a big part, which many people would say you've just got to fund these things properly and then you get results?
Well, I mean, it has been. So to bring it to life, the budget I have now in Sheffield is about half what it was in 2010. I don't think the problems we're facing as a city, or the population we have as a city, or the 800 odd services we deliver are half as difficult to deliver. I think public money is clearly a big part of it. I think one of the things that the challenge that is being grappled with, and I would give both myself and my colleagues and others in national government the push to think about, is how we leverage public money better. I think we are still not great at thinking about how we bring private investment in a way that that speaks to that model of growth that actually adds value, as opposed to just accepting, well, here's some private investment and that's what they, and this is the definition of this is what they want to get out of it. So we'll thanks very much, we'll take it. So there's a need to get really smart about how we bring funding together. And I suppose more to bring that to life on the things that Charlie's been speaking about, there's all of that money in the private sector that all of those businesses are thinking about around how they support their colleagues and their workforce through challenges. That is resource that exists, and we need to be, I guess, think more broadly about how the money we have in the public sector is capitalising that. And then also, as I think Helen, part of the reason to want to drive growth is that we need to increase the size of the pie, because we've got a very challenging fiscal situation, and we do need to get to a place where we can invest more in public services.
Yeah, and then maybe Charlie on that point. I mean, to what extent does public money help in achieving what you want to achieve?
Well, I mean, Kate's making a massively important point. So, I mean, the fact is, like it or not, we are in a world where there are limited funds, public funds, and that's not probably going to change dramatically anytime soon. There might be a bit of parceling up of the pie, but it's not going to fundamentally. I can't see a world where you get back to 2010. But also, I think I used to spend a lot of time in the skills world while back with UKCS. And what used to frustrate me is that we spent all our time talking about what the public expenditure was on skills, and not nearly enough time talking about how much employers spent on skills. And these numbers are wrong now, but I mean, I'm roughly thinking it was like 50 billion versus 3 billion. And so we spent ages stressing about how we spent 3 billion, because it's got some public dimension to it. and hardly any time thinking about how we influence the 50. And more than that, how could you use, I mean, the analogy is you've got a massive boulder, which is called 50 billion, and you've got a little fulcrum called 3 billion. You should be thinking about how do you create a crowbar, which you stick on the fulcrum and use to shift the 50. And you're probably going to get a much bigger outcome. And I think in the context of so many of the big issues we face, I mean, actually, I'd go further. I'd say, I don't think we can solve the issues that we look to government to solve without engaging the whole of society in doing that. We simply cannot look at government with the resources and the capabilities they've got to do it. There's no way to do it. There's no source of public money will solve that. So you have no choice but to do it. And I think it's becoming increasingly important in fiscally constrained circumstances. And also there's an opportunity. And I think if you change your attitude towards that and you approach it in a thoughtful way, if you do, for example, labour market policy with employers rather than to employers, you probably can unlock so much energy and find resources, financial, but also just energy to start tackling some of these issues. And so, I think it's not just important, it's critical.
Thank you. Well, it's time to bring in you, our audience, online and also in the room. So let's start taking a couple from in the room. We've got some roving mics. 2 hands there at the back. Want to say who you are and.
Sure. Hello, my name's Emily Andrews. I'm Director of Research and Policy at the Learning and Work Institute. I've just got to say in response to that, to Sir Charlie's point, if you're interested in that question, keep an eye open for our Nuffield funded research on employer investment and skills coming in 2026. But actually, I'm looking for a bit of inspiration from the panel, basically. We've all had this experience of reading and, let's be honest, leading or funding work which should speak to these big questions of our day, but doesn't. But I would like to flip that round and hear from Charlie and Kate. What is a piece of research that you've read that has really helped you in the things that you're trying to solve? And Helen and Ravi, what's a piece of research that you are aware of, preferably that you weren't responsible for, that you think has shifted the dial? What's getting this really right, and what does that look like?
Okay, well, let's give them a chance to think of something. Let's take the question from the gentleman behind while you all dredge something up.
Hello, I'm Russ Urgel from the Nuffield Foundation. Lots of discussion about good social investment and effective social investment, but given the constrained environment we're living in, what does the panel think are social investments which have poor returns on economic growth, either in relative or absolute terms, that are currently being deployed or being considered being deployed?
Right, okay, we've got sort of challenging couple of questions there. Does anyone want to start with the question of maybe what's inspired you? If you said you read anything,
I forgot that. It's a really good question. One of the first things I did when I was asked to lead this review is I read the previous reviews that have been in this space, and some great people have done some work. Stevenson Farmer, Carol Blackstone, really great people, and I've talked to them all as well. And one thing that struck me is that there's generally been an excellent problem definition from those pieces. And actually also some great recommendations from those pieces. I think what I would say, though, is there's not been enough attention to how you get those recommendations to happen. And so one of the things I took from those pieces, I'm not sure they qualify with your definition of research quite, but they sort of are in that field. But one of the things that I decided right early on is that we would spend as much time as we could on the review on the how. Because truthfully, the answers aren't that complicated. Often not so hard. We could all come up with some version of that quite quickly. But it's how you get it to happen, and how you get that to happen at scale, and how you drive momentum. So that's been a hugely important factor for us.
Kate, you got to.
So I'm going to be really honest and say that one of the challenges I think I face, and I paraphrase this by saying I did a master's in social policy research at LSE, so I like reading research. I don't have much time to read research in this job. I rely on teams to do that and colleagues to do that, including policy teams in a city like Sheffield that are tiny because of the resource we have. So one of the challenges I think we have, and one of the things that's really exciting about policy campus work, is recognising the financial constraints we're under, building that team cross central, local and regional government that is almost working together on bringing together, whether it's academic research, whether it's funded research. I think to Charlie's point, part of the reason it's difficult is because not much research speaks to. So how does this work in practice? Actually, Nesta do great stuff on this in a much more practical way, I think. So I suppose if I were to say, like, what's the ask of foundations, it is that space of how do you get curious about why it is that we have done really great, robust, fantastic world-leading research on so many of these big questions, but we somehow haven't impacted on the ground on action and implementation. And that sort of gap between the gulf between the thinking, the analysis, and the doing, the messy reality of how things actually are, the capabilities, the contexts that impact on how things land on the ground. The fact that, doing the job I'm doing, if I could clone myself, I could have a clone. Maybe that's what I'll get AI. I mean, that seriously, it'd be great to have. I'll just get my AI to tell me what I should do. But that, I think, is a serious point. Like, it's how do you speak to busy people who want to do the right thing and help them shape their services, shape their work around what works. And I think, we've never really got that right. And even what works stuff has been a little as Ravi's described, a kind of, Manchester have done this, roll it out in Sheffield. It's not thoughtful about the context. Hope that helps, I have to be honest.
Yeah. Ravi, do you want to have a go? What have you read that you think really impressive piece of research? Maybe you take the second one as well. What investments have you seen that have had really poor returns? Yeah. And you think springs to mind?
So actually, I think that the research that Gavin mentioned that your team did on Sure Start is an example of something which I saw it change the debate a little bit in the sort of Westminster elite and even possibly Bridget Phillipson's mind. A few years ago, people weren't even mentioning Sure Start as a thing, and it was slightly embarrassing. Whereas now I think there is a surge of support for actually we should do this. They may not be able to have the money yet, but I think that's genuinely shifted policy debates. I think in conjunction with the research you've just published today on the 2-child limit, it may actually be an interesting debate about where you put your money. I think the other one was sort of Raj Chetty's work in states, which we ended up replicating. I think it did sort of start revealing to you what aspects of social capital matter to social mobility. It was just smart in the way in which you can access a data set that exists through Facebook. I think one of those are sort of revealing fundamental research questions about social change. One that's a bit more about an intervention was MindSpark in India, where they just showed that the potential for computer-assisted learning that's actually genuinely adaptive, as opposed to learning at someone's pace, had a much bigger effect size than all the other interventions. So this speaks to my earlier point about more life-changing interventions with bigger effect sizes, and that's one example I think that really did that. And then just on sort of so I'm mildly sceptical about investment in trams and trains, Kate. I know it's not allowed from your. The two bits of skepticism. One, just in terms of who benefits from what forms of transport infrastructure is an interesting question. And that lots of people on low incomes focus on they walk, they get buses, and they don't actually use trains and trams. And I think that there's a huge amount of money that's spent on big infrastructure. Secondly, from a future-proofing angle, I assume that we'll have autonomous cars and that self-driving vehicles will be actually more routine, and we will actually need these big, quite expensive forms of transport infrastructure. So I dial down our reliance on that.
Yeah. Am I allowed to come back in on that?
I'll just bring it first. Sorry, Ravi, you're talking the Raj Chetty. This is about geography matters in people's life chances.
This was about how cross-class friendship matters to social mobility. Yeah. And it was the one that was replicated here, but it was started off in America. But frankly, all Raj Chetty's work is amazing.
Well, before we let you come back in, Kate.
I'll talk in brief. I mean, look, this is something I think about a lot in sort of an existential way. That we're a research organisation at IFS. If I didn't think it had impact, I would genuinely just get another job, right? So I've thought about this a huge, especially in the last 6 months of taking on this job. I mean, look, I think you can always point to specific pieces of work, like Sure Start's a good example, where there's kind of a really clean line between you did this piece of research and it had an impact because it lands at the right time, it captures imagination. That piece of evidence was critical in some sense. There are other examples of that. I mean, some of the work I've did on NHS productivity, I think really put productivity at the front of that debate, and it just changed how departments think about things. So you can always find those, and they're great when you find them. But actually, if I think about the impact that IFS research has had over many years, actually, I don't think more often than not, it's not about here's a piece of research and it moved the dial. I think much more about us about creating people, actually. We create people, we create expertise, we create bodies of evidence. And it's as important that we've got the evidence. It's important that you've got the people around the evidence. You can go and speak to the busy people and say, not here's my new result today, but like, actually, I'm an expert in this whole field. We've thought about this. Here's how to have a conversation with you about how you would adapt it to whatever you're doing. So, you know, when I go and talk to, I spent decades about tax. You know, civil servants don't usually want to know my latest estimate. They want to know how they've got a problem with designing loss offsets. How do they design loss offsets? And I can help them with that based on having built this expertise. So I believe more and more deeply over time that in the kind of production function of having impact, you absolutely need new research that moves the knowledge boundary forward and fills evidence gaps. And sometimes the evidence gaps are so gaping that in and of itself moves a dial. But actually, we need a set of people around that. That's all of us really, that actually can help bridge that between the kind of new knowledge and I think that's where often we don't do well enough. Actually, we have people doing policy and people doing academia, and actually connecting those better. Which is not about asking people like Kate to go read research papers. It's about having other people, I think, who can do that translation piece.
Okay, I want to come to some online questions, but very quickly, Kate.
No, it's okay. I mean, I guess what I'd say is, I think I'm not going to spend train. I'm going to defend public transport. So you're absolutely right on bus, and you're absolutely right on. My point is, we've got infrastructure that is unused. We've got totally serviceable rail lines that could be converted to tram train that could connect people to jobs that they can't access. You've got communities that are isolated all over the country from opportunity, and I just think I can't say enough. Like, I think until you live in a place where you have many young people either not seeing opportunities that are literally, you know, the best example I can give is the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre on the edge of the M1 in Sheffield. Incredible apprentice opportunities there, jobs that are kids coming out of school, getting apprenticeships, going into Boeing, going into McLaren, starting out of their apprenticeship on £45,000 a year. The vast majority of young people at that apprentice training centre come from South Yorkshire. There isn't a single way for anyone to get there on public transport. That is massively cutting off opportunity and aspiration to young people. You know, people feel they have to move away to go far, and I think, respectfully, I think like you can't understand. I've lived in London 20 odd years, and you just don't see it and don't experience it until you're out. So yeah, I think there's something about the balance.
We visited that site for Newsnight. It's the site, the Battle of Albury.
Yes.
And it was striking how hard it was to get to. But let's go to some questions from the
There's a train line that a tram could go on, just saying, right next to it, with no trains on it.
So we've got a question from Jamila Hussain, who's leading one of our strategic fund projects on living well in later life in Bradford. So she's based up in Bradford, and so her question is: I work with disadvantaged and racialized communities, and a major concern amongst those group is the potential impact of the reform government and the risk to sort of social foundations and growth that they think that might be. It'd be interesting to sort of, you know, hear from the panel. I suppose the question that, you know, within that there is a question about sort of community connection and belonging. So I'd be interested to sort of get reflections on that.
Is that the only one, or should we take another one? Or is that
I would like to encourage those online to ask some questions.
Okay. That's a very tricky question. I was talking about a hypothetical government, but Charlie, let me just have to throw it to someone. But you know, the ethnic and racial dimension of the workplace, is that something that you're looking at in your review?
Not directly, because you know, we basically taking everybody to the workplace, which is racially incredibly diverse and rich. So not directly. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question around which I'm careful responding to it. I mean, I think fundamentally, the way I see it is there are some really there's some big issues we face in this country. That's true. But most of them do not lend themselves to very simple solutions. They require careful and systematic reform and then adoption and support by many people in order to drive change. And so my belief is, I guess, that that's what we have to try to encourage and to try to develop. And of course, you have to deal with who is in front of you and who you're dealing with, not who you might wish to have in front of you. You know, you could take the argument that says that if you're of the view that all this surge in young people who have mental health issues is just a sort of, I don't know, it's just that they need to become sort of less sort of flaky. I mean, I just don't buy that. You have to deal with what's in front of you. If somebody believes they have a mental health condition, that's their reality, and you have to deal with it. And so you might think that wasn't the case, but you've got to do that if you're addressing ill health and conditions, and you've got to think about how do you make sure you do that in a culturally appropriate way. You have to do it in a culturally appropriate way. By the way, it's not a great reason why you do this regionally. You don't try and do it nationally. We've had fantastic conversations with across the country about how well people are doing that in places, because they just do it naturally. It's just the natural thing. Okay.
And Kate, obviously Sheffield's an incredibly diverse place. Do you think about just broadly on the question of how do you cater to different communities?
I mean, I'm glad you didn't. Obviously, I'm in a particularly restricted post, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I will comment on is how massively important it is for us to understand the really rich diversity of all of our different communities. And actually, I sort of alluded to it earlier around family hubs, but whether it's work on connecting, regenerating estates, or whether it's work on connecting people to jobs and skills. And interestingly, we've been doing a lot of work through Pathways to Work in South Yorkshire, and it's the way that we've been enacting those opportunities to work with people who are economically inactive has been through working with very often quite small community-based organisations who know their communities, so who are able to, who are trusted. I suppose from a research question, just to kind of go broader on this, I think the thing that we don't understand well enough is how do we get under and understand this incredible gulf that is growing around how people trust institutions and who is trusted. How does that link with social media questions that you were talking about earlier, and how do we the problems we need to solve relate to agency, they relate to people feeling like they can be part of making their lives better. How do we as public institutions connect with them better? So, but yeah, it's a huge part of the work we do, and we're trying really hard to get the balance right between equity and fairness, and also recognising that different communities need different things, and those things change.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I think we can take maybe a couple more from the room. The gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Emma Stone from Good Things Foundation. We're a digital inclusion charity, and I suppose I've just been a bit struck by the relevance of one of our key asks at the moment, which is how to ensure digital inclusion can be baked in, not bolted on, to when we're thinking about research, when we're thinking about solutions, when we're thinking about policy reviews. There's a real risk at the moment that we talk a lot about AI, misinformation, those are so important, but we miss out on some of the fundamentals that still you've got millions of households who are really struggling to have the access to afford the connectivity, the devices. This isn't just older people who might be struggling with confidence support. It is also really impacting on young people, exactly the young people you're talking about, really impacts significantly on disabled people. And yet it could be a real enabler. And it's not there enough in the data, because the data sets aren't enabling us to see how engagement and access to the digital world is impacting on people's health outcomes and education outcomes and all these things that I know really important to Nuffield Foundation and to those social foundations. So I was just interested in your view. Do you think there is a gap in evidence across these different sectors on that issue? And is that something that, if we understood more about it, could be an enabler for more sophisticated policy and other interventions that don't see digital as a bolt-on, that really recognise it as part and parcel of what living in 2025 is?
You pass the mic over.
Thanks. I'm Josh Hillman, the Director of Education here. My question is for Charlie, although others might want to join in. And it's a thought experiment, which is if you were to be told by the Secretary of State that you could pause your work for 3 years and come back and start where you left off, what's the evidence that you don't currently have that you would like to see that could be generated in that 3-year period?
Okay, well, let's come to that in a second. But Ravi, maybe you can, this is a digital inclusion one. It strikes me as a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because mental health issues are related to digital absorption of the social media, and yet you also have a problem of some people not having access to that. So how do you think about that challenge, that trade-off?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you think about where health and education and a whole set of government services are going, they're more predicated more than ever on a certain degree of access. I think what we probably don't know is how much the average conceals quite a lot of diversity, not just in terms of actual access, but usage and comfort and ease. And that's where I think there's probably more research to be done, and probably more interventions to trial about how you increase usage and ease and participation, even if you solve the physical infrastructure.
Okay, Charlie, this is we'll have more opportunity in the reception afterwards. So if you've got any questions you want to ask, please come on to the panel after that. But Charlie, on the evidence you wish.
I didn't catch your name actually. Joshua. Yeah. So I'll sort of actually mix up both Joshua and Emma's. I'm probably going to be taking a bit of license to your question, Emma, because I'm not talking so much about digital inclusion, but you went on to talk about data, which I think is sort of, and actually Ravi made a really interesting point about accountability dependent on having data. And so without wishing to sort of tell you everything, I think data is incredibly important. And so, what you expect to see in the report is a real focus on the importance of improving the data visibility within this whole. And precisely in many ways because it does unlock the opportunity to solve problems in different ways and to pull levers that you can't pull without data. And not least to get people on board and to sort of get people to want to do things, because if you can show, the best thing to drive adoption is to show people evidence of impact, but of course it has to be evidence which they believe and they find compelling. So much of this does actually lead to this question of data. And so to Joshua, to your point, I think we're almost in exactly the opposite approach. So we're not, no one's going to say to me, we're going to pause the work and wait for us to see what data we've got. Because unfortunately, if we did that, if things carry as they are, we'll be just as blind in terms of data as we are today. If, however, we choose to tackle that issue and we find practical and rapid ways in which to start building both far better data sets and improving the quality of the data, I think we can drive some. I think that can be hugely important. And just to give you a sort of flavour for it, even if you just had a consistent way of measuring absence, of measuring the success rates in terms of return to work, and the level of participation by disabled people in the workplace, and you had employers who were seeking to improve those three things, you wouldn't have to tell them what to do. They would be doing quite a lot of the right things just by focusing on those outcomes and measuring them again and gathering data in a reliable and dynamic way. So I'm fully signed up to the camp that this is incredibly important.
Yes, I think we probably can all agree that data matters immensely, no matter what angle of these questions we are coming from. So I'm going to hand over to Keith Burnett in a moment, but I just want to thank our panel, Charlie, Kate, Helen, and Ravi, if you could join me in thanking them.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you very much to the panel. It was an absolutely wonderful discussion. It really was absolutely wonderful. What I do have to say, first of all, having spent 11 years travelling from the centre of Sheffield to the MRC at Rotherham, I can confirm that better transport network is needed. Also to Leeds and to Manchester, actually. But one thing that struck me about it very, very forcibly is just how much we're talking about enabling individuals to flourish. And I was very struck what you said, Charlie, about lack of communication between people on these issues. And I was thinking back in circumstances where my own family had illness that stopped them working. What did they have? An enormous amount of social capital and connections that enabled them to know how to talk to the employers, gave them confidence to do it and things of that sort. So that really, absolutely, you're right there. The other thing that strikes me, I spend most of my time not here mentoring early career researchers. Now, these are people who got PhDs from Berkeley, Princeton, and other places. It is still phenomenal how much they benefit from people linking them to opportunities and capabilities, helping them through circumstances, things of that sort. So I'm a really firm believer that the development of what you can call social capital of relevant networks is something that we do not do well in this country. You know, we do not do well in terms of that, and we can do an awful lot more. So that is wonderful to hear it in various forms. Alex would want me to talk about our strategic grant initiative, because in this circumstance, there are the grants that are addressing many of the issues that you've talked about. There's also the outline that Gavin gave of the key things in our strategic framework going forward. But I did want to say that as well as looking to these things, we are really keen on looking for some bigger possibilities. And that's why I put aside about 15 million to fund projects, you know, between 1 and 3 million. You heard about the DETON review, for example. That was one of our strategic projects. We really love the idea that people would come forward with bolder, more inclusive things of that sort. And the deadline's March 19th, is that right, Alex?
Yes, I think so.
That's what you told me, so I've written it down. Yes, that's right.
It's in March.
And if you want to hear more about it, talk to Alex or people in the room. It's something that we really want to think about. We love the idea that there are bigger things come forward in that way. As I said, it will be a great blessing to it. The last thing I did want to say as well, which has come up in discussions had with John earlier on as well, this idea of implementation. And you were saying, Charlie, in terms of how much time do you spend thinking about the problem, how to cook it? I think that's right. And what you were saying, actually, Ken, is that in some situations, the gap is so great and so powerful, it's obvious you can pick it up. But I think in lots of situations, it's not. I mean, if you looked at Helen was talking about the ideas of when it is powerful, it can drive through. Other times it doesn't. So I think thinking about how we do that, if there's a great strategic project about how you take the great wealth of research that's been done in the past and apply it to something new, that's just as important or even more important. Anyway, I'm not going to go on because we're now going to have a drink and get very excited out there and talk to each other individually. But can I thank again the panel? You did a brilliant job. You kept to time. You punched through lots of the issues. Ben, for wonderful chairing. And to you for coming here today. I just want to, you are, as a community, as scholars, as commentators, as people involved in foundations, you are the community we want to draw in now as part of this strategy. This is a recruitment effort, right? You know, we put down things we'd like to do. We know it can't be done just by us. Some things will be in ADA, in NCOB, in Family Justice Observatory, but we're really keen on bringing in people who've got enthusiasm and ideas to address these problems in the future. So thanks for coming here. If you want to be a recruit, line up. We'll talk to you afterwards. But otherwise, have a drink, enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.